here in the mountains, no one will find you. After all, you're just a stranger to us. Take care now." With a harsh slam, my mother-in-law closed the door of her luxury SUV, a cold sound echoing in the stillness. The tires spun gravel into the air, then she sped off, leaving me behind. Under the moonlight, I saw her face. For the first time, a cruel smile spread across it. Her eyes glinted with a dangerous light, like a predator who'd cornered its prey. She looked down on me with a certainty of victory. "Mom, why?" My trembling voice faded into the night, drowned out by her triumphant laughter. Her voice revealed a side I'd never seen before, stripped of any facade. The chill of winter wind brushed my cheek as I watched her lean out of the car window, pointing at me and laughing. "Goodbye, dear Emily. No one's coming to help you. By tomorrow, you'll just be food for the wolves." Her words hit my chest like a blade of ice, piercing through me. The powerful engine noise of her SUV cut through the silence as the headlights vanished slowly into the dark. I could only stand there in stunned disbelief. I tried to turn on my phone, but the screen remained dark. Suddenly, I remembered that she had borrowed my charger, supposedly to take photos. Everything started connecting in my mind. She had used the excuse of showing me a stargazing spot driving 100 miles out here. Looking back, I realized it was all part of her plan. Maybe if I had listened more, tried to understand her, things wouldn't have come to this. Maybe if I had faced things more seriously with my husband, they would have accepted me as part of the family. The distant sound of animals made me shiver, and I couldn't help but huddle tighter against the cold. I felt as though something was watching me from the shadows between the trees. Fear crept through my body, and I trembled uncontrollably. The sounds of footsteps crunching leaves grew closer, and my heart raced. With shaky steps, I began to back away. But in the darkness, I had no idea which direction was safe. Suddenly, I heard heavy footsteps behind me. I am Emily Matthews, 26 years old, married to my husband John for 2 years. John has been so kind to me. He's helped me countless times with his gentle support. Even when I wasn't feeling well or was overwhelmed at work, he was there. He'd even cook dinner for me on late nights. Marrying him felt like the best decision I ever made. I did everything I could to support him as he supported me. My own parents are well off, and I grew up comfortably thanks to their success. I had the privilege of attending lessons and traveling frequently as a child. Despite that, they never pressured me, and I was able to grow up freely. Friends often admired me for my independence and strength. I'm grateful for my parents, though I also pride myself on the efforts I've made personally. I know money doesn't solve everything, and how one uses it matters greatly. Maybe that's why I disliked being perceived as living off my parents' wealth. I even kept my family's wealth a secret from John. I wanted to work and live by my own efforts. John and I both loved our work in the bridal industry. I had a supportive boss and sweet juniors, and my work brought me joy. Surrounded by admirable people, I was truly content. One day, though, John quit his reputable job to start his own business. At first, I thought it was a shame given how hard he had worked to get that job. But I could understand his desire to carve out his own future. I felt a bit worried, but I trusted him and decided to support him. After all, his determination reminded me of my own. I swore to stand by him, no matter what happened with his business. This was the first time I felt such a strong urge to support someone. But as I later discovered, John had been involved with a woman from his university days. Not only that, but he had amassed $50,000 in debt from extravagant trips with her. At the time, I had no idea. I was horrified by my own obliviousness when I found out. Learning the truth crushed me, and I cried for days. For some reason, despite the debt, he went ahead and started his business with that woman by his side. Starting a business is costly, and I supported him, oblivious to the truth. I once asked him how he planned to manage the finances, wondering how he could afford it all. He claimed he had family support. That surprised me since I'd never considered relying on relatives for support. His mother, Susan, seemed to dote on John and openly favored him. Susan took care of John, even though he was an adult, and justified anything she did as being for her son. She even suspected I was after John's income, despite my own successful career. Sure, John had a good job, but I wasn't planning to quit my own work and rely on his income. I had made that clear to her as well. I continued working and contributing to the household as I had before we were married. We both agreed to handle our expenses individually and save as needed. I explained this to her, but Susan wouldn't believe me. She treated me as though I was an enemy, as if I'd taken her son from her. It was deeply frustrating, but I tried to endure it, knowing it wasn't uncommon for in-laws to have conflicts. At least we weren't living together, so I only had to deal with occasional messages or unannounced visits. However, it wasn't just Susan who was difficult. John's sister, Megan, also had a challenging personality. Megan didn't work and relied entirely on John's income. Apparently, John transferred her a monthly allowance from his account. At the time, I didn't think much of it, seeing it as his kindness. Megan once said she quit her job because her boss had asked her to speak formally. She complained. Why should someone be superior just because they were born earlier? Even though we were close in age, I found myself thinking kids these days. It felt like she embodied all the worst traits of Gen Z entitlement. Interacting with her was draining as I constantly had to monitor her mood. Despite all my frustrations with his family, I was happy with John. I truly wished our happy life would continue forever. For a while after John's business took off, it seemed stable and I felt reassured. He likely treated his employees well, which comforted me. But soon, Susan and Megan started visiting frequently, often without notice. They would rummage through my things, using my brand name items and posting photos online as if they were their own. I tried to tell them politely to stop, but they dismissed me. We're family, so anything in John's house is ours to use. It was all my stuff, bought with my money, but I endured it for John's sake. However, the weight of it was slowly wearing me down. Coming home became hard, knowing I'd find them going through my belongings. I loved brand name items not because of their logos, but for their quality and design. To me, they symbolized my own financial independence. It was something my mother always encouraged. Invest in quality, and it will last. But watching Susan and Megan handle them so roughly was heartbreaking. They were using my cherished items for their own social media clout. Every night, I carefully cleaned my bags and accessories after they were done with them. I began forcing myself to believe that maybe it was my fault, that my heart was just too small. One day, though, Susan took one of my bags without permission and ended up damaging it. It was a simple brown purse, beautifully crafted and easy to carry. How she managed to break it was beyond me. I thought she might finally show some remorse, but instead she refused to apologize.
It was bought with John's money, so I don't owe you a thing.
I felt devastated. Even though I was making a good income, I couldn't afford to replace things endlessly. I reminded her the bag was something I had bought before marriage. It had been my first big purchase, something I'd wanted for so long.
Yeah, right. I know that girls like you don't have money for things like that. Don't try to fool me.
She'd labeled me as a gold digger, spending John's money on luxuries. Talking to her felt impossible. She wasn't even trying to understand. She seemed to see me as her enemy. When I tried to speak with John about it, he barely listened.
Just hold on a bit longer. Mom's going through a rough time.
It hurt to feel ignored even by him. I'd always thought of myself as strong and independent, but feeling so alone was too much to bear. Around this time, John's business started facing difficulties. He was struggling even to keep up with Susan and Megan's lifestyle. He finally told them he could no longer support them financially. Both Susan and Megan, who had lived off his income, were frantic at the thought of losing their comforts. I thought they might consider getting jobs, but they had no intention of working.
Take some of the money Emily has been getting from John and give it to us. Family should come first.
I tried explaining again that I split living expenses with John and used my income independently, but they insisted that I was still living off his income. Their frustration grew and they started visiting less often. For a brief moment, I thought they might be considering working for themselves. I was naive. They were just plotting something else entirely. They had decided that if I were out of the picture, they could control John's income entirely. With John's business nearing bankruptcy, they were desperate to keep up their lifestyle. Though they'd barely worked, they seemed to feel entitled to luxury. Eventually, they discovered that I came from a wealthy family. Now they wanted access to my income as well. Susan especially seemed consumed with a growing resentment toward me. She started to believe that if I disappeared, they would inherit everything. She even convinced herself that she'd get an inheritance worth hundreds of millions. It was absurd. I hadn't even written a will, and if I had, my family, not them, would be my inheritors. It was frightening how much Susan's fixation on money twisted her thinking. She began planning to eliminate me for the sake of her own comfort and lifestyle. Susan had noticed that I enjoyed photography, particularly of night skies. She researched locations with minimal human presence, choosing one where no one would find me. Her plan was to take me there and abandon me, leaving me to whatever fate the wilderness had in store.
Out here, no one will ever find you. It's bear season. This will look like an accident.
She'd even discussed the plan with Megan, who agreed without hesitation.
I'll drive for you, Mom. I'm doing it for John.
Despite pretending it was for John's sake, it was really all for themselves. On the day of the plan, Susan called me and offered to take me stargazing. They hadn't visited in a while, and both seemed unusually friendly that day.
I heard you love taking pictures, Emily. There's a spot with beautiful stars nearby.
Susan showed me the location on her phone, a famous spot among photographers. I'd wanted to go there, so I accepted their invitation with some hesitation.
Your hair is so beautiful, Emily. What shampoo do you use? I'm so glad to have a stylish daughter-in-law like you. I always wanted a daughter.
I felt uneasy, but they seemed so friendly, talking excitedly about fashion and beauty. I began to relax, thinking maybe they were finally accepting me. At the time, I didn't realize it was a trap, but a small part of me felt so happy to be included. When we arrived at the spot, they pointed out the stars, and I eagerly stepped out of the car.
Go on ahead, Emily. We'll join you after we grab some things from the car.
I stepped out, looking up at the stars in awe, just as I'd dreamed. But soon I heard the car door slam shut. I looked back to see them locking the doors, their engine roaring to life again.
We'll be taking the house in the car. Watch out for bears, honey.
I watched in shock as the SUV sped off, leaving me in the cold, empty mountains. I realized they'd truly abandoned me. The only light left was from the stars, my phone unable to reach any signal. Left alone, I felt a wave of fear but steadied myself. I was determined to survive and had my own backup plan. Meanwhile, Susan and Megan were confident that their lives were now secure.
This calls for a celebration. Let's have dinner at a fancy restaurant once everything's settled.
But their glee didn't last long. When they arrived back home, they found several police cars waiting in the driveway, and there I was, standing beside my father and a few officers watching them approach.
What? How are you here?
I met them with a calm smile, one that I hoped showed all the hurt they'd put me through. Megan tried to slip away, but the officers stopped her. I had shared my location with my father through GPS, a safety measure he'd insisted on since I was young. As a wealthy family, we knew that there were always people who might target us. My father had prepared every possible security measure, including a private jet that could reach me in minutes. The moment I activated the emergency button, he was alerted. Since the spot was a clear area for stargazing, landing wasn't an issue. I was rescued without a scratch and safely taken to a family retreat. On the day, I told the police everything. I had recorded the entire car ride thanks to my father's advice to always record when suspicious.
We'll be taking the house and car. Watch out for bears.
Susan's voice rang out from my phone, clear and incriminating. It was all the evidence the police needed. They arrested Susan and Megan right there, charged with attempted murder and fraud. Megan collapsed in shock and Susan fainted on the spot, both of them foaming at the mouth. Their disgraceful behavior was captured by the media present, eager for a sensational story.
I only did it because Mom told me to.
Megan broke down in hysterics, crying and blaming her mother. Meanwhile, it was revealed that John had been with his mistress the whole time and he's testified against his family. Finding out about his mistress was another shock for me, but at this point it was a minor betrayal in a sea of larger deceptions. The media had a field day with the story, portraying Susan as the mother-in-law who plotted to inherit millions. Headlines mocked their downfall, and soon the story was all over national news. My parents, who worked for a well-known company, found themselves thrust into the spotlight as well. On social media, rumors spread about Susan and Megan using my personal items. John, who had prided himself on his reputation, now couldn't even step outside without facing shame. Surprisingly, someone leaked Susan and Megan's phone numbers, and they were bombarded with calls. I almost pitied them, but mostly I felt a deep sense of relief. The next day, their bank accounts were frozen and everything they owned was seized. Without John's income, they couldn't afford anything. News of his mistress was shared all over the internet and John's reputation was completely destroyed. He'd betrayed me, and now he'd lost everything, including his dignity. I learned that even from the start, John had been living with his mistress. Remembering the kindness he once showed me felt like a cruel joke. Why had he married me if he'd never truly loved me? My heart ached, filled with pain and betrayal, but I resolved to move on. Susan and Megan were evicted from their luxury apartment and placed in a public housing unit. It didn't take long for their location to be leaked online. Susan became mentally unstable, muttering that her life was over. Megan, on the other hand, was cast out by her own family. Each of them reaped the consequences of their selfishness and greed. Megan tried to work part-time jobs but lacked the skills and work ethic.
Emily, please help me get a job like yours. Working at weddings and wearing nice clothes sounds like something I could do.
I ignored her message. The bridal industry was not something to take lightly. They had brought their ruin upon themselves, and I was finally free of their toxic influence. Susan moved into a rundown apartment, barely holding together, surrounded by graffiti and decay. I, on the other hand, left the house where I lived with John without a backward glance. I left all my possessions behind, too, those tainted by their careless hands. Returning to my parents' home, I felt safer, though the emotional scars lingered. One day, John called me unexpectedly. I felt a pang of dread just seeing his name on the screen.
Emily, I'm so sorry. I've got ties with my mom. Please, let's try again.
I answered, but his voice grated on me. Despite his grand promises, I couldn't forget how easily he had betrayed me.
I'll protect you forever.
His words sounded hollow. I didn't need his protection. I could stand on my own. I coldly replied, maybe your mistress could use your protection instead. Memories of the good times briefly came to mind, but I quickly shook them away. I couldn't believe I'd been so blind. I sobbed that night, releasing all the pain and anger that had been bottled up for so long. Meanwhile, Susan sat alone in her apartment, consumed by resentment. In a desperate attempt, she hired a private investigator to dig up any dirt on me. She thought if she could find something to use against me, she'd regain control.
I don't belong here. This is all a terrible mistake. Detective, find something. Anything on Emily.
The detective, seeing no valid case, simply reported my recent activities. But even that tiny bit of information made Susan's eyes gleam with malice.
Emily has PTSD? Oh, this is my chance. I'll make her pay for everything.
Susan began plotting, fueled by her desperation. John, who was equally miserable, secretly supported her scheme.
Mom, if you succeed, share some of the money with me. I want to build a new home on the coast.
Completely unaware of their new scheme, I tried to resume a normal life. One evening, as I walked alone, Susan appeared on the sidewalk. She looked worn down, her clothes shabby, but a sinister grin stretched across her face.
Guess the bears didn't get you. Must have been freezing in those mountains, huh?
Her sudden appearance brought back a flood of trauma, and I could feel my body shake with fear. Memories of that night returned vividly. The terror, the loneliness. I saw her lift her phone, recording me as I stumbled back, powerless.
I have you now. Pay me, or I'll spread this video all over the internet.
The shock of being abandoned that night had left me with PTSD. Susan's threat made little sense, but the sight of her was enough to terrify me. She climbed into a waiting car and disappeared, leaving me paralyzed. Realizing I couldn't handle this alone, I called my father for help. My father was furious, knowing how much pain they had caused me. Using every resource he had, he began digging into John's business dealings. Soon he discovered evidence of tax evasion and embezzlement. Confronted with proof, John had no choice but to admit guilt. His mistress Lena, who had no idea of the depths of John's corruption, paled as the truth emerged.
You lied to me, John. I didn't know my name was on those loans.
I had to. You were always demanding more luxuries, more vacations.
You told me we'd have $100 million.
Their entire plan had unraveled, exposing their lies and manipulations. John's accounts were frozen, and he lost everything. Lena tried to play the victim, pleading with the media to clear her name.
I didn't know. I thought he was honest. I was just another victim.
The tabloids seized on her story, framing her as yet another pawn in John's downfall. In one headline, she was the victim mistress. In another, the scheming partner. John's world came crashing down, with even his mother now refusing to support him.
"You're no son of mine, not after all the shame you brought on us."
Despite her own part in everything, Susan abandoned him the moment he was of no use. With no one left to turn to, John was utterly alone. Each of them had exploited others for their own gain, and now they were all paying the price. John and Susan, finally realizing their isolation, decided to join forces in one last desperate move. They planned to escape by taking a flight and disappearing. But my father, ever vigilant, anticipated their move. He had security waiting for them at the airport, ready to intercept them.
"I did it all for my son's happiness."
Her voice echoed across the terminal as she screamed, half crazed. But even in her desperation, she was willing to throw John away. Watching their meltdown was surreal, like seeing the true depths of their selfishness laid bare. John, visibly shaken, could only mutter about his lost dreams with his mistress.
"I was supposed to have a new life with Lena."
Hearing his words stung, knowing he had completely disregarded me. I had once loved this man, promised a life together, only to be discarded so easily. Looking back, I realized that I'd rarely been betrayed by others before, but John's betrayal cut deep. It would take time to heal that scar. Meanwhile, as I watched from afar, Lena held a press conference as the new CEO of John's company. "I'll restore the company's reputation and protect our employees' livelihoods." She had somehow taken control, and despite everything, was determined to carry on. Lena had her faults, but she was now taking charge, more competent than John ever had been. John, stripped of his title and possessions, was left with nothing, forced to live on the streets.
"I trusted my mother, and even she betrayed me."
Susan, too, spiraled into mental breakdown, repeating that her son had betrayed her. Their selfish actions had led them to complete ruin, leaving them to confront their empty lives alone. Month by month, they struggled with debt repayments, a descent that was only just the beginning. Watching them, I felt nothing but detachment. I was gradually healing from PTSD, regaining strength and stability. I could finally laugh at the absurdity of it all, seeing the once powerful family brought low. I hoped no one else would ever have to endure such a family ordeal. My experience gave me a new mission, to help those who had nowhere to turn. I wanted to provide a refuge for others, a safe space for those escaping toxic families. With my PTSD, I had to leave my job in the bridal industry, but it gave me a new purpose. I told my parents about my idea, and they supported me wholeheartedly. They guided me on how to start, qualifications, legal requirements, hiring. With their help, I gained knowledge, researched online, and expanded my skills. I began studying for certifications and talked to others who could offer insights. Little by little, my goal became more tangible, and I found myself enjoying the challenge. The family retreat, where I was once rescued, became my first refuge center. We kept the location confidential, sharing only the phone number with those who needed it. I wanted to create a place where people could escape without fear. I even earned a qualification in counseling, driven by my desire to help others heal. When the refuge center finally opened, I felt a wave of hope. I knew it would be wonderful if no one ever needed to use it, but sadly, that was unrealistic. There would always be someone out there trapped in an unsafe situation, needing a way out. I hoped my experience would help me bring light to others. Susan, Megan, and John were still dealing with their financial struggles. They were now paying for all they'd taken, a reminder that debts must be repaid. One day, a woman came to the refuge escaping from an abusive family. I looked at her and told her she had done well by getting out. I told her that I, too, was glad to have left when I did and wished I had left sooner. Her expression softened, and she smiled through her tears. "Thank you. I thought it was all my fault." I reassured her, letting her know it was okay to acknowledge the pain and hold boundaries. Here, no one would need to fear retaliation or worry about their family finding them. My father's security company guarded the facility 24/7, ensuring each person's safety. It was my safe haven, just as it was for others who needed a fresh start. Over time, the refuge grew, welcoming more people who needed a family they could trust. I found myself smiling genuinely for the first time in years.